All right, we are back with another one. More apologetics for slavery in the Bible. I am scouring the internet for any type of good argument in the defense of biblical slavery. I realize that's kind of a contradiction in terms because what kind of argument is a good argument for the defense of slavery? There isn't one. So I'm going to keep trying. Maybe it's out there somewhere. Maybe somebody could finally make biblical slavery make sense in an honest way. I'm not going to hold my breath, but this is a new one. This one came across my feed as a recommended video and it looked interesting. This is RZIM HQ. The title of the video is The Contemporary Conflation of Slavery in the Bible. Now, I've heard the contemporary argument before, but I don't buy it at all. If slavery is immoral back then, it's immoral now. It always has been, and no God should give rules about slavery except to end it immediately. But let's see what they have to say about it. Slavery in the Bible, hearing from enslaved Africans.
Now, admittedly, I struggled as to whether I wanted to include a video discussing the ongoing problem of slavery in the Bible. Not because I think it's unimportant or that it's been sufficiently addressed to be a moot point, but there are so many other...
Well, I appreciate the way he's starting this video. He's saying it hasn't very well been addressed, and that's true. He's saying that it's not a moot point, which is also true. But let's see if he's going to be honest in his apologetics.
Incredible achievements and critically important historical events concerning African Americans, faith, and culture that I initially balked at discussing this topic to the possible inclusion of other topics. But as I began to think about the contemporary relevancy of this subject, three groups came to mind. Number one, atheists who continue to think that the Bible condones slavery and is...
The Bible does condone slavery. The Bible condones slavery. I don't know why people can't just admit it. Why can't you just admit it? It condones slavery. Condone, to accept or allow. Deuteronomy. Nope, that's the wrong one. You may buy your male and female, or your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy slaves. They will become your property for life. Condone, to accept or allow. You may buy slaves. I don't know what's hard about this.
Is therefore a significant moral flaw in an omnibenevolent God.
It's a huge flaw in an omnibenevolent God. It's a massive flaw. What do you mean, man? Come on. It's omnibenevolent. All good. All good. No bad. None. Zero bad. All good. 100% good. Cannot make a mistake. Cannot be wrong. Cannot be evil. You may buy slaves. It's a huge flaw.
Number two, Christians who are confused by the descriptions and dialogue of slavery in the Bible. And number three, African Americans. You see, we share this unique post-traumatic bond to slavery, so this subject can be of particular interest and concern. Now, the confusion that often concerns slavery in the Bible is primarily due to our conflation of pre-Civil War or antebellum slavery.
No. I've heard this argument before too. I was really excited because it isn't cross-examined or got questions, or Dan Kim. This was new. I was really hoping that he would bring me something different. Here's the whole thing with it's not comparable to antebellum slavery, chattel slavery. This is the one point that they can defend, but it's also a point that nobody is making. They've invented a problem and came up with a solution to that problem. But the problem in the first place isn't a real one. Nobody is saying that the biblical slavery is comparable to modern day slavery in the sense that it was race based, because it wasn't. It was ethnic based. They didn't like other ethnicities. They didn't like people that belonged to another nation or anybody in the surrounding area. It didn't matter their race. That's true. But also, nobody makes this claim. So Christian apologists have invented this claim because it's defensible. Yes, I'm giving it to you. It was not race-based slavery, but nobody says that it is.
In the Bible. This comparison, which I'll elaborate more on shortly, and our subsequent
To be more clear, I want to hear his elaboration, but in every other way, it's very, very comparable. It's just not race-based. There were slave traders. The slaves were being bought and sold. I mean, we'll go back to it again. You may buy slaves. You may buy them, purchase their property. Like, in every other way, it was comparable. But let's keep going. We'll see what he has to say.
Version to it in the Bible is understandably made due to our familiarity of the abhorrent nature of pre-Civil War slavery. So I think it's helpful to think about this subject from the perspective of the two primary pillars of both of these forms of slavery: the motivation and the treatment. Economics was the motivation for both antebellum slavery and the slavery described in the Bible. Antebellum slavery concerned colonists desiring free and perpetual labor. Now, this, of course, was achieved through the socially constructed idea of race, and that being this idea that race isn't a biological fact, and subsequently the supposed racial inferiority.
Wait, did he say race? It seems like he said that race is a social construct, but that it's also a biological fact.
The socially constructed idea of race, and that being this idea that race isn't a biological fact, and subsequently the supposed racial inferiority
I don't know what he's saying.
The transatlantic slave trade marked the event in which millions of Africans were kidnapped and forced.
There he goes with this kidnapped bit. So I can only assume he's going to bring up, and I don't know, but I'm going to assume he's going to bring up the bit where kidnappers are to be put to death. But this is another very boring apologetic. That rule was to protect slave owners from having their slaves stolen, and that law only applied to fellow Hebrews, their own clan. It only applied to God's chosen people, not the nations surrounding, the heathens in which you can buy your slaves. It didn't apply to them. Maybe he won't, but the fact that he brought up kidnappers, I don't know.
Forcibly brought to the Americas, with millions dying en route. All of these factors and others meant that pre-Civil War slavery was involuntary. But slavery in the Bible was quite different. First off, the very Hebrew word that's often translated as slavery in the Bible, or as slave in the Bible, given our modern sensibilities, is more properly rendered as servant.
Two quick things about this argument. I don't care is one. Servant or slave, I don't particularly care. But I'm just gonna give this argument to him that everything in Exodus 21, those rules, I'm just gonna give it to him. Fine. It was voluntary servitude. But for those years, it was voluntary servitude for some. Involuntary servitude for others. And others being, of course, women. But even if it was, at no point in time is owning another human being. I don't care how well you treat them. It doesn't matter how well you treat them. If, let's just say that there is a husband and a wife, and in modern time, there's a husband and a wife, and this husband takes care of all of his wife's needs: clothes, food, anything that she could possibly want. It's hers, but she's not allowed to leave the house. Is this moral? Is this ethical? Is this good? She has no freedom. She has no autonomy. She belongs to somebody else. That's where that's why even this whole indentured servitude business is still disgusting. If you if you're ever curious if this was good or it was bad or it was neutral or if it was better than some, just ask yourself, was this person free to go? And if you say no, then it's wrong. It's immoral. But we're going to keep going with it. But I wonder if he will get to the actual slavery part. So I'm going to give them Exodus 21. I'm just going to say, fine, it's disgusting, it's immoral, it's wrong, but it's indentured servitude. It's not slavery. But what about these slaves? Wrong one again. Leviticus. What about these slaves? These slaves. Nobody wants to talk about these. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life. This is the slavery that I would like to have addressed. I have yet to find one Christian apologist who addresses it in its proper light. What they'll do, if they bring these verses up, they'll try to conflate it with this verse, do not rule over them ruthlessly, and make you think that they're talking about these slaves. But no, this is talking about Israelites, not the other nations. But we'll see what he's going to go with.
And this would actually make sense given their cultural context. You see, slavery...
My goodness. Okay. I didn't realize I'd have to pause so much. I'd like to let this guy get a couple sentences out, but every other sentence that he says is stupid. In their cultural context. I don't care about their cultural context. If you take a God out of this equation, then this statement makes perfect sense. This is their cultural context. It was a relatively uneducated people living in antiquity who just don't know what we know now. That makes perfect sense. It was immoral, it was wrong, but that's how it was. And I understand that. The problem is when you add an omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent God into the mix, because that God knew better. And these are his rules. These are the rules he gave the people. It makes no sense when you throw a God into the mix. We'll keep going.
The Hebrews in the Old Testament typically occurred when individuals sold themselves into servanthood to pay off debt.
Okay, this is going to be a longer video. The video's only 8 minutes long, but there's so much dishonesty going on here that you have to pause every other sentence. Voluntary service. Okay, so he's referring to Exodus 21. He's not talking about the war captives who you can force into labor. He's not talking about the slaves that you can buy from the nations around you. He's talking about fellow Israelite slavery. And I already granted that, okay, fine, we'll call it some type of indentured servitude. But what about the rule that says when a daughter sells his father, or when a father sells his daughter? What about that rule? Who is that voluntary for? What about the rule that says if you have a slave, a Hebrew slave, if you're a Hebrew and you have a Hebrew slave, and you have a wife and kids, when your time is up, the 6th year, 7th year, whatever it is, the women and children stay. You're free to go. But they have to stay behind. What about these rules? How voluntary is that?
Therefore, it was voluntary.
Okay, well, I just addressed that,
the Hebrews actually had laws prohibiting kidnapping.
There we go.
Exodus chapter 21, verse 16.
There we go. There's the kidnapping nonsense. So this rule only applies to Israelites. And it doesn't say slavery. It says kidnapping. This was a rule to protect slave owners from having their slaves stolen. They didn't want that. They didn't like it. They made a rule about it. It's it's okay.
And Hebrew slaves or servants were not subjected to that same kind of perpetual bondage like in the case of pre-Civil War slavery.
Um in some cases, yes, in some cases no.
Their servitude was akin to a contractual agreement where they would be released after 7 years.
Unless they weren't. I mean, all right. Well, we see, now we got to bring it up. So we've made this pretty clear. Let's bring up Exodus yet again. All these apologetics are the same. One day I'm going to get something new. I just know I am. So Exodus 21. Let's find out if there's any type of circumstance where they're not free to go after 7 years. Okay. But in the 7th year, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything if he comes alone. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. But wait a second, we're 4 lines in. If the master gives him a wife and she bears him son or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. Okay, so that's one way to keep the women and children. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then take him before the judges, pierce his ear, then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter, where's the contract? You know what I mean? Like, let's keep going. This is nothing I haven't said 100 times.
Now, the treatment in both instances was also vastly different. Again, due to this false idea of racial inferiority, enslaved Africans were viewed as subhuman and therefore were treated as chattel or property.
Chattel or property. It's the same. Chattel means property. They were treated like property. Oh man, we just got rid of that verse, right? What was it? Leviticus. I'm sorry. Oh, it might still pull up. Let's try one more. Okay, Leviticus 25. There's 44. So let's see if there's any type of way that you can have a slave that will become chattel or property, as he just said. Do you read that? And they will become your chattel, your property. Okay, let's keep going.
Torture, rape, murder, and family separation were all commonplace examples of the kinds of impunity that slave masters could use to try and create this docility among the Africans. Yet again, this was a far cry from what was legislated in Old Testament servitude. The book of Leviticus, for example, notes that the master is to treat his slave as a yearly servant and is not to rule ruthlessly over him.
Do you think that if we went to Leviticus... Wait, what was it? What was it? Did I already cover this? Yeah. Do you see how boring these apologetics are? Do you see how the same it is? I called this out. I've already covered what he's saying now with accidentally. And I said just rewind the video. I said the apologists try to conflate it with the term above it that they're not to be rolled over ruthlessly, which is true for the Israelite servants, but not for the other slaves. But see, he's now making this conflation. Oh, where were we?
Treat his slave as a yearly servant and is not to rule ruthlessly over him.
Do you think that rule applies to slaves or to indentured servitudes?
Now, this isn't to say that there were never times when a master mistreated his servant. It's not what I'm saying at all. But the point is that if any such treatment did occur, it was deemed as morally unacceptable.
Okay, I'm listening. How is it deemed morally unacceptable aside from causing some type of permanent injury, killing him? I think there's something about the tooth and the eye and this and that. So is this what he's going to give as his what did he call it?
It was
Morally
deemed
unacceptable.
unacceptable.
So unacceptable. If I said, "Hey, you can do this," would you deem what I just said as? Would you think that I'm saying what I just said you could do is unacceptable? I mean, no, right? So if I say, "Hey, take that whip, that cane, or that rod, spare the rod, and beat that human being over there, but do not kill him. You can beat him severely, but he has to live for the next couple of days at least." Would you say that it's unacceptable? What after hearing me say that, would you be like, "Wow, he's deeming that morally unacceptable"? No, I just said you could do it. That story got a little out of hand there, but I mean, I think you get the point.
And there are various Old Testament laws that will support this idea. It's also important that we consider what formed the grounding or the moral foundations that established how the Israelites were to treat.
Are you not going to give the laws that support the idea? You're just gonna skip right over that one? Come on. Well, anyway, you could beat your slaves as long as they don't die within a day or two.
Others. Number one, this uniquely Judeo-Christian notion that all human beings are made in the image of God, which means that in spite of one's social status or ethnicity, we are all of equal worth and value because we were made to be like God, but not the same as God.
So this Judeo-Christian, this is another terrible apologetic. Yes, I do believe that Christ accepted virtually everybody. I do believe this. I do believe that that is the narrative. He wouldn't care about your race or your social status or all these different things. But please remember that what he's referring to is in the eyes of God. What he's saying is, hey, if you're a slave, don't worry about it. Just be a slave. Obey your master, especially the cruel ones, because you're going to go to heaven. And this is the language that was used in the Atlantic slave trades. Languages like that. Slaves, obey your masters. And surely God would have known that in 2,000 years, those verses would be used, 1,800 years, whatever, that those verses would be used to support slavery and still allowed them to be written. But hey, we all make mistakes, right?
The Old Testament character Job affirms this idea of equality when speaking of the master-slave relationship. He says, "Did not he who made me in the womb make them?" Of course, referring to his servants. And he also goes on to say, "Did not the same one form us both within our mothers?" Now, secondly, Israel's own history of enslavement in Egypt served as a reminder of how it should treat others. Old Testament scholar Christopher J.H. Wright notes, Israel looked back to 4 centuries of slavery in a foreign land, which had become increasingly oppressive,
Can you prove
inhumane, and unbearable.
Can you
The
prove that?
experience colored their subsequent attitude to slavery enormously. Now, there's much, much more that can be said about this topic. You know, there's the question of non-Hebrew slaves, and there's instances of slavery in the New Testament.
That's what I'm looking for.
Now,
That's what I'm looking for is the non-Hebrew slaves. I'm going to give him some credit. And I mean this genuinely. He just mentioned it. Now, he didn't go into it, but he mentioned it. That's impressive. It really is.
Some of these I've addressed in an article in the description to this video. And in the future, I plan on writing more specifically about some of the really challenging Old Testament passages.
I'm very curious. How old is this video? 3 years ago? Maybe he's written more. I'm going to take a look because I'm curious. I don't know why you can't just say the Bible got that wrong and you have to make some type of flowery language to try to support it, but I'm gonna take a look at that. Maybe he's true to his word and he's written about those passages, because the other apologists won't even bring them up. So I'm impressed.
But instead of going into those, I'd rather spend an additional moment giving an important postscript to this discussion, particularly in light of this being Black History Month. I want to really encourage all the viewers to take the time to read some of the narratives from enslaved Africans during the antebellum period. They were victimized by the perversion of many biblical texts by slave masters.
I mean, show me that it was a perversion. Don't get me wrong. I know that there was like the slave Bible and that these verses were, but do you think that the verses from the Bible weren't said verbatim?
And ministers in order to substantiate their subservient role and rooted in this divine mandate. Yet instead of merely adopting the heinous interpretation of racial inferiority, the enslaved Africans often noticed an incongruity in the messages between what the master or minister conveyed and what they came to discover in the text.
Why was the master and minister conveying biblical texts to support slavery? Why is that a thing they could do? You know what I mean?
Texts themselves. So, although they had been psychologically traumatized, many enslaved Africans, such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and Olaudah Equiano, discerned that this message of predestined African inferiority was simply false. So if anyone had reason to question the moral aptitude of the God of the Bible, it was those enslaved Africans. Now, also, the slave narrative served to humanize the enslaved Africans during that period. They were real people with thoughts and feelings and intellect, and their narratives possess a wealth of stories and reflections that not only provide us insight into their thoughts on this subject, but also further connects them to the contemporary reader.
Sure, I agree.
As the distinguished African American theologian, writer, and social activist Howard Thurman aptly noted, by some amazing but vastly creative spiritual insight, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. In our next video, I'll sit down with Lisa Fields of the Jude 3 podcast to discuss some history.
So, I mean, the last minute and a half, 2 minutes or whatever, I mean, he didn't say anything that wasn't true, except for right at the end. I'm not 100% convinced that the slave these masters were misusing the Bible. You know what I mean? Of course they were misusing it. I'm not sure that they were interpreting it incorrectly. I kind of think they had it right.
And issues concerning the Black church.
Okay, definitely not the worst apologist I've heard. He was right on par with everything, except for he did better. He did better than most because he at least mentioned the actual slavery in the Bible that cannot be misconstrued as indentured servitude or anything else. I'll end this one with saying, I don't care about the time period. I don't care about how the slave was treated. I don't care how much the biblical laws on slavery improved upon other laws, which I would like to see these other laws that they were improved upon. I don't care about any of that. It was human beings owning other human beings as property. And this was commanded by God. This God is your foundation of morality. And it makes zero sense to me.